Friends, there was silence in Brussels yesterday. But this is not the kind of silence that comes after wise decisions and well-considered steps. It's the silence that comes after being hit in the face. European officials, who for a long time considered themselves important intermediaries between the United States and their nation-states, suddenly faced a stark reality. They are no longer of interest to Washington. Donald Trump said that his administration no longer considers the European Union as a single structure and will build relations exclusively with individual countries. Simply put, the EU is no longer a subject of world politics, but has turned into a set of disparate states with which the United States will now negotiate individually. This is not just a rhetorical gesture, but a major change in diplomatic strategy. Trump immediately began to implement these changes in American foreign policy. Friends, get ready. The news that has already shaken the European Union is starting to gain momentum. The European Union has always been proud of its common foreign policy, claiming that it has a common position on the most important global issues. But in reality, it was just a series of compromises in which the interests of individual countries often overlapped the general European course. France and Germany promoted their ideas, Poland took a position of resistance, Italy maneuvered, and the countries of Eastern Europe agreed in order not to lose European subsidies. However, now the EU may lose its status as an important player on the world stage. If Brussels is no longer perceived as a significant force in the eyes of the United States, then the concept of the EU as a single political player is collapsing. The European Union is turning into something more than just a union. It becomes a bureaucratic illusion, unable to act effectively on the world stage. As German political scientist Thomas Fritsch notes in an interview, the lack of perception of Brussels as a key player leads to the destruction of the entire political concept of the EU. Pierre Lemoyne, a French expert on international relations, also emphasizes that Ursula von der Leyen and her team have lost their political subjectivity. Even if Washington no longer sees them as significant players, a logical question arises. Why do European countries need them at all? This turn of events has already given rise to disturbing conversations in Brussels. Without the support of the United States, the European Union may face internal weakening. Germany, with a strong economy, may try to play its own game, separate from the interests of other countries. France may move towards greater independence, while Poland and Hungary will find themselves in a difficult situation. These countries used to support an alliance with the United States, but now they will have to negotiate directly with Washington. Trump's strategy of focusing on bilateral relations has serious consequences. The United States will now be able to manipulate European countries individually, weakening the common front of the European Union. This is especially beneficial in matters such as trade, military alliances, and energy policy. Unsurprisingly, this is causing the most concern in Berlin. For many years, Germany has used Brussels as a tool to advance its interests, but now this tool has turned out to be either damaged or completely unnecessary for the realization of its goals on the world stage. According to analysts, the United States is interested in weakening the internal coordination of the European Union, especially in light of Europe's economic ties with China and Russia, which displease Washington. Therefore, it can be assumed that Trump will seek to offer European governments more beneficial bilateral agreements in exchange for loyalty. According to British analyst Nigel Robertson, Trump is well aware that European bureaucrats are linked to globalist elites who promote their interests through Brussels as an intermediary. It is no coincidence that the first steps in Trump's new policy have already touched Europe. Germany and France have begun discussing new terms of trade and defense agreements with Washington. At the same time, Warsaw found itself in a rather difficult situation. Previously, Poland used Brussels as a shield against pressure from Germany and France, but now it will have to build relations with the United States directly. It is noteworthy that Hungary, on the contrary, supports Trump's actions. Viktor Orban has long criticized the Brussels bureaucracy and now feels stronger, because Trump has actually recognized Budapest as an independent player on the world stage. Among Trump's potential allies is Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who, although cautious in her statements, clearly tends to Washington's right-wing conservative agenda. However, as noted by French political scientist Jean-Marc Lafont, there is no second Trump in Europe. Even right-wing populists like Marine Le Pen have their own interests and are not ready to blindly follow Washington. which makes relations with them quite difficult. In addition, Germany is still dominated by a left-of-center ideology, and Trump's approach is clearly not shared. However, the Alternative for Germany party is already looming on the horizon, whose leader Alice Weidel recently received public support from Elon Musk, an unofficial ally of Trump. It is quite possible that Berlin's political vector will change in the coming years. The EU is faced with a choice. Either it adapts to the new reality, or it will face gradual weakening and possible division. Germany and Poland may begin to build their strategic lines, which will lead to further fragmentation of Europe. As noted by Spanish analyst Javier Santos, a gap between Europe and the United States is inevitable. The only question is whether the EU will follow the path of confrontation with Washington or begin to change from within. Trump's decision to recognize Brussels as a useless mediator is not just a diplomatic gesture, but a fundamental shift in international relations. The United States no longer sees the European Union as a single entity and intends to work with each country separately. Despite the fact that Brussels is still pretending that nothing has happened, the real political situation is already changing. If the European Union does not build a new strategy, we may well witness the historic process of dismantling the EU in its current form. While Europe continues to bind itself with new rounds of sanctions pressure on Russia, Donald Trump, apparently, is returning to the old policy again. He is ready to leave Europe aside in resolving the conflict, as well as sacrifice his closest allies for his own benefit. And the most interesting thing is that Trump does not even hide his intentions, but openly demonstrates his line. If we recall that Russia made it clear in advance that negotiations with Europe were impossible, it becomes obvious that Moscow and Washington will decide the future of the conflict without the participation of Brussels. This caused panic in European political circles. The German edition, citing sources in Brussels, reports that EU diplomats are literally furious at the prospect of being in the role of an outside observer. Europe has long considered itself a major player on the world stage, but now, in fact, it is turning into a spectator with no influence on key geopolitical issues. The Figaro newspaper adds that this is a political disaster for Brussels. After all, until recently, the EU claimed a leading role in world politics, and now it is actually deprived of the political subjectivity that allowed it to be a significant player. Meanwhile, there are very mixed signals coming from Washington. According to the Washington Post, Trump not only does not want to continue financing a well-known country, but also categorically opposes its accession to NATO. Translating this into understandable language, the United States seems to be planning to completely distance itself from this geopolitical project, leaving it on the shoulders of Europe. And this puts Brussels in a very awkward position. After all, if Washington refuses to pay for this political and military game, then who will take responsibility for the conflict? Is Germany on the verge of recession? Is France gripped by protests? Or Poland, whose economic performance is alarming? Russia, for its part, has made it clear that it is ready for negotiations, but only if the issue of the legitimacy of power in a certain country is resolved. As you know, the current leader of this country was not only elected bypassing democratic procedures, but also signed a decree prohibiting negotiations with Russia. At first glance, this legal conflict looks absurd, but it is precisely this conflict that hinders any diplomatic process. Apparently, Trump agrees with this, and it is no coincidence that the first step has already been taken in the White House, the temporary cessation of funding for military programs related to this country. This is not just an economic measure, but rather a political signal. Either the process of a change of power will begin inside the country, or the United States will finally wash its hands of this conflict. The time limit for solving the problem with the legitimacy of the government is 90 days, and if no solution is found, the deal with Russia simply will not take place. Russia, in turn, has taken a confident position. According to a Russian insider close to the negotiations, the Kremlin has made it clear that there can be no talk of any settlement unless the security architecture in Europe is completely revised. In fact, the world can be divided into spheres of influence without taking into account the interests of Europe. Trump, like Putin, acts with typical pragmatism, and Europe's interests don't seem so important. And as always, Europe is the last to know. While Ursula von der Leyen is talking about new sanctions packages and declaring solidarity, Brussels is actually on the periphery of world politics. The whole situation looks like a grandiose geopolitical replay in which the United States and Russia are building a new architecture of the world, and China is adding its efforts to this process. Europe finds itself in a corner, stamping its foot indignantly, but there is nothing it can do. In politics, it's not those who shout louder who win, but those who know how to negotiate. And apparently Trump, Putin, and Xi are going to negotiate, not von der Leyen and her colleagues. Europe can only wait for Brussels to officially announce that no one else is interested in its opinion. However, for now, Europe continues to believe that its future depends on its own decisions. This naivety may turn out to be the worst enemy of diplomacy. Europe tried to convince itself that the era of American dictatorship was over. However, as Donald Trump has shown, this was a naive misconception. In his speech, Trump made it clear that Europe would either buy more American gas or face high tariffs that would permanently undermine its industry. This statement particularly hurt Germany, which is already facing deindustrialization, abandoning Russian energy resources in favor of American LNG. This is not only costly for the German economy, but also causes problems with factory closures and investor flight. The German economist noted that Germany has two options: either go broke by buying American gas, or simply go broke. The German leaders seem to be at a loss. Usually, European leaders like to show confidence by emphasizing the unity of the EU, but this time no one even tried to object. France and Germany are too busy dealing with internal problems, and the UK is struggling with an economic crisis. European leaders, as it turned out, were shocked by their helplessness. After all, Trump has shown that the threat to Europe is not himself, but her own self-deception. Previously, Europe tried to pretend that it had a strategic course, ready to support U.S. initiatives, especially in the energy sector. However, von der Leyen called these efforts the price of freedom, which is paid not by Brussels bureaucrats, but by ordinary EU citizens. Hungary and Slovakia have openly stated that they are no longer ready to put up with the sanctions, calling for their revision. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán quipped that if sanctions against Russia are so effective, then why is Europe's economy in recession while Russia's is growing? Trump also recalled that Europe's military spending should increase. It requires EU countries to spend at least 5% of their GDP on defense. However, this question is rhetorical. Brussels is already considering the possibility of cutting social programs, which will affect medicine, education, and pensions, in order to find funds to buy American weapons. In his speech, Trump made it clear that he sees the European Union not as an equal partner, but as a set of countries that should contribute to America's greatness. The only question is when Brussels will realize this. So far, Europe is torn between trying to save face and the need to admit the obvious. In the New World Order, its role is becoming less significant. Friends, does Europe really not understand what is going on? Or is he just pretending not to admit his powerlessness? The United States no longer sees the European Union as an equal partner, but Brussels stubbornly clings to old illusions. How many more blows to self-esteem do you need to realize that the time for diplomatic games has passed? And now it's up to those who know how to act, and not those who have been writing resolutions for years. While Trump, Putin, and Xi are building a new global architecture, European leaders are deceiving themselves by accepting new sanctions and thinking that this makes them stronger. But isn't it like a struggle for influence without real influence? Europe is on the brink of political oblivion, and the main question is whether it realizes this before it is too late. Reading this material, one can't help but feel that Europe has signed its own verdict. For too long, she assured herself that she could still be an independent player on the world stage. Time has passed, and now Europe finds itself in the role of a helpless spectator, watching as the United States and Russia build a new order, while it keeps trying to preserve the old myths about its importance. Trump, as always, makes it clear that if Europe does not want to be an economic and military appendage of America, it will have to pay the bills. But it is unlikely that Brussels realizes that the old mechanisms are no longer working. Europe is trying to save face, but no one seems to take it seriously anymore. Thank you for your attention, friends. See you.